Alrighty, well it is 1:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for being here. My name is Kendall-Totten and I work for Red Hat. I'm the UX Dev Team Lead and Front-End Designer and Developer for redhat.com. So my talk today is all about reduce, reuse, recycle, modular CSS, specifically targeted towards enterprise level sites if you're trying to build a giant system for lots of designers and content admins and developers. However, a lot of the principles here are completely applicable for agencies. You could build a similar system in which you could build patterns and styles and use them again and again through different client websites. So if you're not an enterprise website, that's okay. You can still relate. Also, if you want to follow along on the slides, it's a bit.ly URL. It's DEA-CSS, and I'll explain what that means later. And on we go. So, I'm going to give you the quick rundown. I'm not going to take too long with this because we've all been through this story before. The story is, your deadline was yesterday. You're trying to build a site as fast as you can. You've got clients that are agitated. Maybe your boss is saying, hey, we got to go. And you say, okay, I'm going to pick a quick framework. I'm going to jump in and get started. So you pick framework of choice, hopefully not Bootstrap, but if you're redhat.com, Bootstrap, and give yourself a leg up, right? You're going to get going quickly. Then you add in the client requests, and even though we're an enterprise site, we still have internal clients. We still have marketing folks, we have people who want to be designers, everybody has a say, so then you heap everything that they want on top of your framework, you keep going. And then there's an evolution of design. So design is a sliding scale, and it's always evolving at a rapid pace. So you're trying to keep up with the industry trends too, right? You see the newest, latest, and greatest thing, you want to work that in. Not to mention the evolution of the web itself, like Flexbox or CSS grids, like the newest hot shit remix. You got to get it on your site. So you end up with this whole lot of code, and there ends up being specificity battles, right? Because you started with a whole bunch of stuff, and then you're trying to put stuff on top of it, and then you're trying to overwrite yourself later. So with CSS, two can enter the game, but only one will win. So you end up with code spaghetti, right? And this is kind of where, when I came to Red Hat, this is where we were at. When I started, I looked at the base theme and I said, for reals, you guys? And they said, but listen, we had all these constraints as I just described. And here's an example of actual code that is currently on redhat.com because we are slowly evolving away from it. So even though we have a design system, we're not there yet. As you can see, this is a little bit, sorry, it's kind of a dark screen here, but this is like 7 selectors deep. And it's really just to get to a display table and important on top of all of that, because we still didn't have enough specificity even with all of this, so that tells you a lot. So you're really left with no choice but to give up, start over, right, throw it all out. In our case, we are slowly evolving one page at a time away from the current system and into the new system. So it doesn't have to be a rewrite from the ground up and do everything all at once kind of nightmare. You can do it little by little. So you throw away your code, you start over. But what are you going to do different the next time around? How are you going to avoid this? So we decided to take the pattern lab, or patterns in general approach. You guys are all familiar with Brad Frost's pattern lab, right? We've been talking about it a lot at this conference especially. So patterns are just about spotting the patterns, but also spotting the differences. Because you're going to create a system, you have to be able to identify trends in your content and where you can reuse things. So once you back up and you start to look for these patterns, you kind of start to see them everywhere. Here's 2 pages on redhat.com, and they're both listing out various features of some of our software and support solutions. So even though the typography might be slightly different, we can start to see that there are reusable patterns here. We have a similar kind of headline style going on at the top, a big headline, and then maybe some little text above and below it. And then we get into the features, and we've got a little icon, and then we've got a blurb of text. So we call this an icon panel. And even though there's small differences, that's okay. We can start to just chunk it into the pattern. But when you see differences, ask yourself or ask your designer, why are there differences? Is it because we were designing in Photoshop and because it's hard to use a little slider to say 16 pixels instead of 15 pixels? Does it really need to be different? Or sometimes, I don't know if you have designers that you work with, or maybe you feel this way where you're like, don't box me in, man, I need creative control and I can't have every page look the same, so we start making little tweaks. But if you're running a giant site, or if you're trying to build quickly and efficiently for a client, you kind of want to focus, right? You want things to reuse. So you have to start naming things consistently. When you're naming patterns, try to use abstract terms that describe the content that houses the pattern and not the content itself. So rather, you don't want to say, this is the about page, or this is the solutions page. And you don't want to talk about the product that's inside of it. You don't want to say, this is the RHEL software styles. You want to say, this is a feature set, or this is a testimonial, right? Keep it abstract. So if you establish a common vocabulary, not only amongst your designers and your developers, but also with your content team and your marketing team, now you're all speaking the same language. Now you're all on the same page. So when you get everybody to recognize these patterns and to see where your style guide lives, you can all kind of get together and create a system. So here's a list of the components that we're actually using on redhat.com. A component, if you are not familiar with the pattern system, is usually a small chunk of information, usually like 1 to 3 elements, give or take. And some of the components that we're using are pretty simple, like an icon panel, we already saw an example of that. A call to action button, that's a component in and of itself, because it's got a link, it has text within it. We have a couple of different styles that we apply to call to actions. We've got featured items, we have image embed. An image embed might have like a little caption underneath it. Maybe you can do a little bit with the padding and like make it fancy. You get the idea. So we kind of keep it generic. None of these are specific to redhat.com. From there, we want to establish layouts. Think of a layout as just a container. It is completely separate from whatever is inside of that container. And it should be highly reusable. So think of it just kind of like rubber bands on a pegboard. You're just wrapping it around whatever's inside of it. It can bend, it can shift, and expand to fit containers, no fixed heights, responsive design. So we've got a basic, on redhat.com, we're using, I don't know if anybody saw the Chapter 3 presentation about slices, but we're using the exact same approach where we just kind of have bands, we call them, across our page. So we've got bands. Group is really just basically a div, just a container. A card has like, oh, we're going to add a little bit of padding. We're probably going to throw a background color on it, something cool like that. Carousels where it gets a little fancy. And then we have raw, because sometimes our designers want the ability to put in artisan code into our website, so we don't put any wrappers or constraints on them, so they can do whatever they need to do. So components plus layouts equals a pattern. So here's the same band we just saw a moment ago, and this particular pattern is called a feature set band, so let's break it down. We have that band header at the top, the basic title, a headline, and then an optional summary. We've got an icon panel, and you can have as many as you want in your band. Your content admins can have 2 or 4 or 6, whatever they want to do. And then we've got that CTA component at the bottom. And within our layouts, we like to provide a little bit of construct to say every single layout that we have has a header section, a body section, and a footer section. Generally, we're only applying layouts to the body because that's where most of our like interesting components live. Usually, we've got like the standard header across the top, and we're not really applying layouts there. But your call, whatever your design system is calling for. And when we do apply layouts, we use it with we do one data attribute, and then that controls whatever is inside of it and kind of throws it into a 2-column layout or a 3-column layout. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So you've got a system, you're on the right track, you've got components and layouts, and then you start writing styles. Things start to get messy really quickly. So what we decided to do was establish a baseline set of rules that control everything in our design system, so we don't have to remember, where am I supposed to put the margin? Is this allowed to have padding or not? Because things are going to start to conflict, and you kind of like, oh, this thing has double padding, why is that? That situation. So we kind of belovedly refer to them as our Roadrunner rules. Is anybody familiar with this concept? The Roadrunner cartoon, they had a very strict set of rules about what was allowed to happen in that cartoon, and it made it consistent. Like the Roadrunner is only allowed to say meep meep. The coyote is he only comes to harm by his own means. The Roadrunner is never allowed to harm him. It's just like, his own stuff blows up in his face. So we've got a basic set of rules here, or maybe more like what you'd call guidelines. So rule number 1. A layout never imposes padding or element styles on its children. It's only concerned with the horizontal or vertical alignment and spacing and like kind of the construct of 2-column, 3-column, a gallery, etc. So here's an example. This is our band container again, and you can see that middle section that houses the cards inside of it. That is our data attribute. We've got a 444, so it's just kind of telling the children what to do and how to behave. But it's not telling them to have a black background. It's not telling them what kind of typography to have or anything fancy like that, just the layout. Themes and other data attributes never force change in appearance. They're just a context that the layouts or the components can subscribe to. And this is an interesting concept, but it's one that I think really changes the game. So this is I don't know if this is unique, but what we're doing, Can you guys see the code? That's kind of blown out, isn't it? Hold on one second. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Barely. Okay, either way. So on our component here, we have a default component, and at the band level, we have this data attribute that says data RH theme dark. So inside of the component, we have a title, and the title says, oh, I see that there is a dark attribute, a theme that's applying a dark attribute. I'm going to decide to be white. When I see that attribute, I'm going to be white. Another placeholder style or component or whatever might say, oh, I see a dark theme, I'm going to be light blue. So each individual component or placeholder style has the ability to decide what to do if that attribute is present. It never implies like a broad spectrum attribute on anything. So this really gives us freedom within our design system, so we can apply one layout in one place at the top of the band, and then the components will behave accordingly. So next rule, a component always touches all four sides of the parent container. It doesn't ever have external margins that say, nothing can touch me this direction, and it doesn't have top or left margins. So here's an example of a band header component inside of a band. The band is applying the padding on the top and the bottom, that just comes standard, and it also applies a max width constraint, so they never go all the way to the edge of the page if you have a giant screen. The component itself, in blue here, is saying, I'm going to go as wide and as tall as you will let me be. So the band is just kind of applying that constraint, but the component is still touching the edges of the container. The component itself never has backgrounds or widths or floats. Sounds a little redundant, but we want to make sure that we have rules for each piece of our system. So a component always has like a transparent background, and it just can show through whatever. If it's in a card that has like a black background, if it's on a band that has a fancy image, it's always going to show through the component. And last but not least, the element has a single unique component scoped class. This is very important, and we're going to get into the CSS portion based on this. So all of the styles are applied with that one selector only. We have a single source of truth. This is the next part of the revolution within our design system. So back to that band header component, you'll notice that we see the titles or the classes seem a little repetitious because you see RH band header in every single one of them, but I always know if I'm looking at this little H3 here, I know exactly what component it lives inside of. I know where it's getting its styles, and it's just this one class. So I don't have any CSS rules in my system that say, if you live in this layout or on this page, then you do X. It's always about that one style selector. And elements never use top margins, so kind of same thing as components, they always touch the top of the container. Just like that. Oh, and we do have a JavaScript rule. JavaScript is never bound to any particular element class. We're using those data attributes again. That way we can have reusable functions and we can apply them to different components in our design system. So we can have like little hover state attributes or click attributes or toggles, etc. Which means less work for us later. If we don't have to fight ourselves, we can just establish a rule set and move forward and go to Hawaii, or at least we can dream, can't we? All right. So the CSS, BEAC stands for Block Element Attribute CSS, which is very similar to Ben. We just modified it a little bit because we really wanted to use those data attributes to give ourselves a little bit more flexibility, but still stick to that single source of truth mentality. So let's talk about a little bit of foundational base rules for Sass. This is not specific to our system, but in general, you want to make sure that you keep an eye on the CSS. You want to know what your Sass is generating. If you are blindly nesting things like crazy or using all kinds of complicated mix-ins, you might end up with a pile of spaghetti in your CSS and never know about it, so keep an eye on it. You want to stay dry, which means don't repeat yourself. So whenever you can, when it makes sense, create a placeholder style, create a mix-in. Be careful with placeholder styles. I would say use them appropriately. What we like to do is keep them very specific. So we like to say, this placeholder style is just about applying typography for a title element. We're not throwing in anything about the display. We're not throwing anything complicated, just like little typography units or maybe little display units. We can use them as needed together. And semantic placeholders, we talked about that. So here's an example just to kind of bring it back home. When we say beaks, which is what we call it, block component is like the container of the component itself. The elements is whatever the little pieces are of that component inside of it. So in this case, we're looking at our CTA component, and so the element is just the link tag inside of it. And then the attribute, there's that data RH CTA type, And that attribute is saying, I'm primary, so I'm bright red, or I'm secondary, so I'm black with a little arrow, something like that. All right, rule 0, because we're developers, front-end developers. So styles are only applied to the classes and never IDs or HTML elements. And we have one exception to that rule, and it is because of Drupal. We have a WYSIWYG editor. So we have to apply some baseline rules to all of the basic HTML elements that live inside of that container, and we have one component just for that use case. So that is just it's called a generic component. We never put it inside of other components, and it's just when we need to allow the freedom to our content admins to kind of do whatever they need to do. You can't expect them to dump classes into a WYSIWYG, right? They're just using the little toolbar. So this helps us to avoid our specificity battles. And the other amazing part of it is you can go and tell your SEO buddy that he can change the H1 to an H2 anytime he wants, and it's not impacting the styles whatsoever, because it's all about the classes. Here's a scenario for you. If certain fields get the content from the WYSIWYG, we talked about this. So here's the example where we're actually just saying our default component, we're extending some of our default placeholder styles, and we're applying it to the individual elements. And like I said, we're only doing this inside of the WYSIWYG. So we're going to bend the rules a little bit in this circumstance. Rule number 1. Every element should have a single source of truth from which it derives all of its styles. So I like to give scenarios because it's really easy to talk about a rule and what you should do, but then you always run into these scenarios where you're like, but what if I need to do X? So if you have an existing component and you've got existing styles for it and you want to add one difference in style, maybe you want all caps in a particular use case, what should you do? How do you accomplish that? Should you add additional styles to the existing element class? No, you don't want to do that because that selector now has two sources of truth. If you have a basic component, we have our component library, and then we have the ability to add custom styles on an individual page basis. But what we don't want is the same selector to live in two places. And you might have the same problem if however you're organizing your design system in different folders or partials. You want to keep all of your styles for that one component, that one element together. So another option is you say, well, maybe I'll just create a new class, and I'll add both classes to that element. You don't want to do that either, because now again, you have two sources of truth, and that component is getting, or that element within the component is getting its styles from two places. So what should you do? Well, you can create a new custom component or element, and this might sound crazy. You might say, well, I'm just adding one style, but it's a slippery slope, friends. We've all been there. So if you really have something that's new and different, let the thing be the thing. Define a new placeholder style, define a new element or component, and create a new class for it. If you really want to keep your code dry, that's where placeholders come in. If you have a placeholder that defines the core amount of styles, then you can have like other placeholders that extend from that. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but let the thing be the thing. You could also, this is where the placeholders come in, you can have a placeholder that extends the original placeholder. So that's kind of a way to keep your code dry. So I've got my secondary headline here, which is extending the first, and down here, my component, I'm just extending one thing. So here's my single source of truth. The nice thing is that since these placeholders live right next to each other, I can very easily see where the inheritance is, where the specificity is, and what happens later if I need to add some kind of text transform to the original element. I can see that there's another thing right below it. Once you get into another file, it's really hard to keep track of where all your things are extending from. So you want to avoid putting extra classes after your extend later on. Rule number 2, when styling elements, use the ampersand dash to append the element name to the parent selector name. This is how we get away from the crazy nesting hell that Sass allows us to do so easily. If you want to reuse your generic headline style in a few different components, you don't want to apply a generic class like UX headline inside of two different components. Instead, you want to avoid adding additional styles just based on that component like we talked about earlier. You don't want to have one source of truth and not two. So avoid that. And I thought I had an example in here of the actual CSS. Oh, I do. Okay, hang on. So you also don't want to list the full element class separately inside of the component itself. So here I have UX component defined at the top, and inside of it I have UX component headline because these match and they live together and that's really handy. But now I have two classes that are applying my styles, and I want to avoid that. So here's what we do. We use the ampersand selector, and we say ampersand dash headline. What that's going to do is append the class to the end of the parent name. So I'm going to end up with UX dash components dash headline, which is one class, one source of truth. Does that make sense? I know the code is really tiny. I wish I could make it a little bit bigger. So this is back to that original example on redhat.com. This is why people say don't use Sass, because it's really easy to get into this like crazy nesting action, and you're like, I have so much context, I know exactly where this thing lives, and I know which page it's on, and it's beautiful, but you end up with these bananas selectors at the end of the day. So here's the example with the placeholder, I'm sorry, the ampersand dash, so I can say rhstats dash box, and I end up with one nice and neat selector. It might be long, and that's okay. It doesn't matter how long it is, but you still have the one single source of truth. Rule number 3. Use extends or write custom style properties and not both. So this goes back to my placeholders. Here's the example. I already have a fancy headline placeholder. It's got everything I want and need and hope for. Oh, except I need color pink. So in my particular component here, I got this nice unicorn headline, and I'm just going to go ahead and like tack that on. But now again, my styles live in 2 different places in my style system. And what inevitably ends up happening is somewhere along the line, somebody's going to update that fancy headline, and they're going to say, oh, I want to opt into themes, and I want to apply this color and that color. And why isn't it updating on this component in this random page? Oh, because you overwrote it somewhere else and nobody knew about it. So keep it at the placeholder level if you need to extend placeholders and like kind of add on to it, and not at the component level. And here's the example of how you could do it. You could just create a brand new placeholder for it and extend the original and throw the color on it. And now down in your components, you're just extending one discrete placeholder style. Okay, so you've got all these great rules, you're ready to apply them to your design system, but you need a plan of attack. Where do you start? Ideally, you kind of start at the beginning and say, okay, let's try to gracefully move away from applying styles to any direct elements, because that's always going to be an uphill battle. Whenever you can move into classes only, now you have a little bit more control. Your SEO friend is going to high-five you. They're going to be really excited about it because now they have more control. And do it in chunks. You don't have to, rewrite the whole system all at one time. Like I said, we are evolving one page at a time. We wrote a custom module, which I wish I could tell you is on Drupal.org. It needs to be reworked a little bit to be more extensible and plug-inable. But anyways, we wrote a module where we can say we're going to walk away from our giant editorial.css file, our giant style.css file, and even Bootstrap. We have a little Boolean for each one of those. So I can say turn it off, turn it off, turn it off. And instead, I'm going to load one brand new file just for that page. And this is to accommodate our snowflake pages. We belovingly refer to them as snowflakes when they cannot conform to the design system and all the patterns that we have. So we're allowing our designers to put artisan markup and code on the page, but they're doing it on an individual page basis instead of munging all of that stuff together and loading it everywhere on the site. Because that's how we got, I think it was something crazy like 18,000 lines, I don't even want to know. It was a banana CSS file, so we're walking away from that. And we're also using, you want to use prefixes to avoid namespace collision. So this may not apply to everybody, but since we have a new pattern system, we have the original Drupal theme, and then we have our artisan code, we wanted to make sure that those things couldn't collide with each other, especially since we're trying to evolve slowly. So in our new systems, we're using a prefix at the beginning to identify what library it's coming from. Where's the markup coming from? What's controlling it? And we don't have to worry about collisions. So here's some resources, some links that you can refer to later on. I want to give lots of credit to Micah Godbolt, who is a contractor from Phase 2 that worked on redhat.com, this project, and really evolved this system. I am just the evangelist and the preacher. So definitely check out his blog post all about this architecture. And I want to show you an example of our layout styles, because we're here to talk about CSS, right? That's how I roped you in. So let me see if I can bring back the page. Does anybody know about Sassmeister? This is like one of my favorite tools. No? Yes? Okay, a couple people, good. I have a sticker, you can't see it. Sassmeister is kind of like CodePen, but specifically for Sass. It's got these really handy plugins. You can have a whole bunch of extensions like Bourbon and Neat and Breakpoint and all kinds of stuff. So it's really handy. But I like to use it to demo my fancy Sass. So let's see if I can show you this. Okay. So what this is we wrote a mixin to define all of our layouts on the site. And you can see here there is a list of all of the layouts. I like to use these ones as examples. Is everybody familiar with the grid system? We're using like a 12-column grid system. So when I say 6-6, that just means a 2-column layout. Each thing is 6 columns wide. So a 6-6 layout, 4-4-4, 3-3-3, you get the idea. And it just loops through, and it does the math based on Susie, and it creates a layout for each one of these combinations. And here's the interesting part. Over here, in our HTML, we have this one data attribute that is defining the layout for that whole band and the kittens. So unlike Bootstrap, I can go in and change the markup in one place, and my band automatically updates, and everything jumps into place. This is phenomenal. I cannot tell you how much easier this makes life, that I don't have to go in and like find all the like different individual elements and apply classes everywhere. What we're doing is we're making assumptions about where we want our breakpoints to occur. So it depends on how much fine-grained control you have. We do have another mix-in where we need like really fancy layouts. But by and large, this gets us by for the majority of things. And if I later decide that I want to add a new kind of layout in here, I can come in and just say like, we'll do a 6-2 or something crazy, doesn't make sense. And I'm gonna go over here and add it. And let me see if I can. Oh, hang on. There we go. So my kitten over here is 6 columns wide, my kitten over there is 2. We've, again, made assumptions. We've said we always want the element on the right to stick to the right side, kind of like a sidebar. But it's nice because it's just doing the math for me. I don't have to do anything crazy or custom, and I have one attribute to update. Pretty snazzy, right? And this code you can get on SassMeister if you want to steal it and reuse it. Let's see. How much time do we have? Anybody? Like 15, 20 minutes, something like that? Okay, good. And, sorry, this is hard to do in 2 numbers. Okay. I want to show you an example of some of the stuff we're doing with Patternkit, as promised as a disclaimer at the bottom of this presentation. It's a little small. Sorry guys, I'm on the struggle bus here. All right. So is this the right one? This is the right one. Okay. This is what we call Patternkit. This is what we are using to preview all of our patterns, our sub-patterns, layouts, components, everything in our design system. We want to have in real time available to not only our designers, but our marketing people, our content admins. We want them to know about it. We want to establish that common vocabulary. They can preview the component, they can resize it, everything's in an iframe so they can kind of see what it looks like on mobile. We have a schema editor because we're defining all of our fields in JSON, and this is just basically a JSON real-time editor that's translating the JSON fields into HTML, and we're using live reload to update it. So your content admins can actually come into their style guide, they can plug in their own content, they can change settings, so I'm changing the color of the logo and the size of it, and plug in their content and see what it's actually going to look like. This is so far removed from the traditional, like, here's your PDF style guide, here's the styles that you're supposed to use. They can actually see it and play with it, and that is so radically different. The nice thing is that once they've got their content in there, we've got a button at the bottom that translates everything that they've done, all their settings and content, into a data URI string, and they can now share this with anybody else in the organization. So we're looking at a local host version, but we do have a style guide that's sitting in our intranet, so they can just plug in that string or email it to somebody, and that person can see all of their content and then see, oh, here's what it looks like at mobile. It looks pretty bad. You may want to put some more content in there. We're exposing all of our information as a JSON data schema. We're feeding that back into the design system so that we have dummy data when you come in here, so it's not just blank. And you can also see the twig template. So our designers, if they're brand new or onboarding somebody, or they're just as a developer that's curious, they can see what the twig template looks like and what the variables are. Everything is right there. And let's see here. Is it looping? Oh no. Okay, so what I wanted to say is that this particular component or this subpattern has a lot of different options in it. Like I changed the color and the size of the icon, but I don't necessarily want to surface all of those options in every single pattern because that could be overwhelming to a content admin. If they're not a designer, don't force them to be a designer. Give them options to just plug in their content and go. So in this particular pattern, this is our feature set pattern, we've basically suppressed some of the options. Like you cannot change the color, the background color of the icon. You can't change the size. What you can do is update the content, and you can swap out whatever the icon is that you want here. But we've just made some assumptions that this is the default feature set. That's what you get. If you need those options, we have one kind of kitchen sink pattern that we call custom bands. And we're surfacing like little smaller chunks, like this might be just an icon panel sub-pattern. This will say, oh, if you want an icon panel sub-pattern, go ahead and add that in a custom band, and now all of your options are available to you. So within our pattern system, we actually are taking like an MVC approach, where not only are we controlling what the end user is seeing on the website and saying, here's the pieces of the puzzle, here's what they look like, here's the JavaScript, but we also care about our content admins. We're able to change what the form looks like to them. We're able to set defaults, make assumptions about what kind of things we want to show. Here's the custom band I was talking about with a handful of different sub-patterns. And then sometimes we want to give them options like layout. So we've got a little drop-down selector where I can say, 444 looks kind of bad, so I'm going to change it. Oh, but now I've got too much content, it's crowded, so I'm going to kill off one of the sub-patterns and get rid of something. That looks a little better. So it's hard to break your design system when everything is spelled out. You can still make an ugly baby if you try hard enough, but it's going to become a challenge. So this has been a huge step forward in terms of giving our content admins the freedom to actually update the content and still exposing options to our UX design team that wants to get in there and make the pages a little bit different and unique and interesting. So, because we don't want every single page to look the same. We're trying to tell a unique story about a particular product or feature or something like that.
What is this tool?
This is called Patternkit. So I tweeted it, and I think it's on the slide that has the resources. This is like kind of the real-time preview of the design system. And then I want to show you one more video.
Is this something you guys built all in-house?
This is based on a JSON editor. So we kind of took some existing code and then enhanced it to make it look more like Pattern Lab. But it's all based on like the JSON schemas.
But it's not like a modified Pattern Lab.
It is not a modified Pattern Lab. I am 99% sure of that.
They're two completely different tools.
Yeah. Micah Godbolt built this, so that's why I'm just the evangelist. Trying to find my other video here.
Is it open source?
It is, yeah. You can have. Exit cookies. There we go. Okay, so beautiful Patternkit, style guide, high fives all around. It looks great. How do we get it into Drupal? We have a pattern builder importer module that basically takes our JSON schema, all of the fields that we've defined, all of the defaults, everything, and it imports it into Drupal. It creates a database field if there is not one already. If there's an existing one that matches, it creates an instance on a per pattern basis. And it actually turns all of these patterns into paragraphs or a paragraph bundle. So we don't have to do any crazy mapping. We don't have to create stuff in Drupal and go back and forth and try to make it match. We're using the exact same templates in the design or the pattern kit that we are using in Drupal and the same exact styles and the same exact JavaScript. So it is a one-to-one. I will say you have to be careful about the way that you build the JSON schema. It has to be strict for Drupal to understand it and for it to make sense. But if you follow the general principles of JSON schemas, that's easy enough. So when we had a turnover in some of our team, and one of our team members was able to pick this up in about, let's say 3 or 4 weeks, she was building patterns actively. So we did kind of some hands-on training, had her build a simple pattern, and now she's building some really complex stuff. So if you can understand JSON schemas are great because they're just kind of like a nested outline, a bulleted list, right? It's a great way of organizing information. So it's beautiful. So here's what it looks like in Drupal. Let me make this a little bigger. And our content type, where we're housing all of these patterns, is called flexible template. So we have one content type right now where we're loading all of our patterns. We've got some basic default Drupal fields like the admin title, or maybe some meta information, summary, etc. And then we're saying, okay, every page needs a hero. We always have a giant background image at the top of the page, and we've got our basic like header information. From there, the sky's the limit. You can add as many patterns as you want. You can see this page is pretty custom, so we have a lot of custom and a lot of HTML or raw HTML where our UX design team is dumping stuff in. The ideal thing is that they are following the exact same principles over in their custom artisan code land that we are following in our pattern system. So when we have enough pages that are using some custom markup and we're like, hey, that looks like a great pattern, we want to use that in multiple places, it's really easy for us to translate it into a pattern. We just build the JSON schema and the twig template, and we can reuse the styles. So if you're adding a new pattern to a page, it comes built in with collapsible field sets. So we're looking at like a quote box here, and I can control things like what does the container do, what is, do I want to add a logo above the quote, etc. I will tell you that Ajax has been a little bit of a pain point for us. It's not the fastest thing in the world, and we were talking about this the other day. We have done some like some finessing of it to try to make it a little bit speedier. So right now this is about, I think it's like a 7 to 10 second load time. It's faster in our production website because we're throwing all the memory at it there, and our sandbox is a little bit slower.
It's worse than Drupal.
It's worse than Drupal. That's good news. So I added the feature set pattern that we were just looking at in Patternkit, and you can see all of the same options exist here in Drupal that exist in that pattern. So when your content admins are playing around and prototyping and then they come into Drupal, it's exactly the same experience. One of the other pain points is that when you're building something in prototype land, you do have to come back and rebuild it in Drupal. We do not have a means by which you can just like say, oh, I've got the whole thing prototyped and just like slurp it in. I would love to see us go there. We haven't put in the development time for that yet. But at least we're getting there. We're evolving the conversation and making it easier for our marketing folks to understand what we already have and stop reinventing the wheel. Just use the patterns that we've got. And that's it. Does anybody have questions? Or do you want to see more code, or what do you got? Go ahead.
So with working with the design team, I feel like all of our ideal is like never to get anything in Photoshop ever again.
Yeah.
You set your patterns and then you get things defined in those patterns. Is that working, or are you guys getting close to actually being able to get comps that are really a set of specs versus a flat,
So we're actually just started using Sketch, which I highly recommend.
use that too.
Yeah, it's a great way of again, reusable components, reusable styles, not having 15 pixels here and 16 pixels there. So Sketch and InVision has been our tool of choice when you're really at the raw design stage, when you really do need something new and you're creating and you're conceptualizing. So we're using that. If we're kind of creating a pattern with existing pieces of the puzzle or just kind of evolving a little bit, we're just doing it right in our pattern library. And because I don't know, I can't speak for everybody. I'm at the point where I think it's faster and easier to just code the thing than it is to mess around in Photoshop or even Sketch for that matter. I'm like, I know what I want it to look like, I know what the layouts are, I've got it all right there. So I like to prototype in the browser. So for people like me, this has been amazing. But you have both needs, so you sometimes still have to start in a program that allows you to conceptualize. Yeah.
So I'd love to share this. Do you have the video of this talk somewhere?
We are recording currently. Hopefully it's recording the right screen. I just thought about that at the end.
Okay.
If not, I'm going to share the slide deck. And I know I just gave this presentation at NC DevCon and they were recording there too. So somewhere on the internet there will be a recording.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
With the import of your patterns into paragraph bundles, you said it creates fields and fields instances. How complicated can that get? Is it just it'll create basic text fields and image fields, or entity references if you want to do that?
Trying to find, here we go. So this website, patternbuilder.github.io, this is going to walk you through the technical backend stuff. Full disclosure, I'm not a developer, so I didn't have a hand in this, but we have a Drupal module and we have the Drupal importer, which is a drush command, and you can say import all of the patterns or import this component in this pattern or whatever. We can also delete patterns the same way, but it is smart in the sense that it'll look for existing database fields. Like I said, it looks at the base and says, hey, do I have any matches? If it doesn't, it'll create one. If it has a match, it'll just create an instance for that particular pattern. So it's pretty efficient from a database standpoint.
And just to follow up, who does the import? People who are quickly making the patterns, or is there specified?
So our UX dev team, we are totally importing all the time, forever on our sandboxes. So as we're building, we want to check things, make sure it works in Drupal. Because as I said, the JSON schemas can be a little, they're a tough nut to crack sometimes. You have to have everything perfect. So sometimes you don't have a one-to-one, it shows up in Drupal and you're missing something, so you got to go back and check your syntax or whatever. So yes, we're importing all the time in our sandboxes. When it gets to production, that's at the development level. There's only sacred people that can do that kind of stuff, but yeah. Yeah.
For a site that's already using paragraphs, are there tools within this or elsewhere to export the schema the right way that you could take what you've already got, throw it in the pattern builder, start styling it so you can set back in?
That's a really good question. I don't know. We weren't in that boat. We weren't using paragraphs previously. I would say if you already have paragraphs defined, you already have patterns. So you already kind of know what your constructs are, and you can say, oh, this is a component, and here's whatever. You can build the JSON schema relatively quickly. So no, we don't have a tool for kind of reverse engineering the thing, but that would be a nice to have. You can, this is on Drupal.org, by the way. The project for this is up and available. And this site just kind of walks you through all of the pieces of the puzzle. Should you want Patternkit? Oh, and a very important thing to note, this is all happening in Drupal 7. So our twig templates, we have a PHP library that's actually converting the twig to PHP, so Drupal 7 can understand it.
I'm thinking probably once you guys get to the point where you're going to move to Drupal 8 to answer your question, I could see, since the paragraphs are actually configurable and exportable as YAML files, and probably maybe start moving away from the JSON and actually use straight out the YAML so you could pull stuff out as well as push stuff back in.
Yeah, totally. Any more questions? You guys want to see any code? I got my code editor open.
I'm a little bit curious about how the backend people manage to clean the HTML output too. Like, it's always fighting. Like, Drupal throws.
They don't get to touch it.
100,000 classes or anything.
They don't get a say. So the UX dev team completely controls the markup 100%. So there's no so originally
their work is just to strip out all these Drupal stuff, like, or is it that?
Their work is to run the drush command. That's it. And then we go into the content type and we turn on the pattern. We say, hey, make this available. So really, it's interesting because there's been a huge shift because now the UX dev team is in control of what the content admin sees, what the end user sees, all of the markup, all of the styles. There's no more hand holding. There's no more mapping back and forth. This came about because we originally did this. We had the patterns, we had everything defined, and then we said, here you go, Drupal developer. And they said, great, I'm going to build a map. And we're like, oh, but wait, we have to change it. And we're changing it again. And change your map. And it was like crazy. We had one content type that took, I want to say it was like 4 or 5 months. And we had, I don't know, there was like 8 or 10 patterns in the thing. So the patterns were easy to build. That was done in like, a couple of months. But then it was like an additional 4 months just to get the back and forth in Drupal to like map everything accurately and to like sort out all the bugs. So we were like, this is not sustainable. We can't keep doing this. We need a system by which we can just have a one-to-one and have Drupal use all of this information that we're defining in our pattern library. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's still just, that is the, probably Drupal is inserting all their classes and all their crap, but then your component is cleanly there, but if you inspect the page, will there be a lot of Drupal junk before you get
so
to the
Drupal, right now the only thing that Drupal is handling and that the Drupal theme is still handling is just the Chrome of the page. Our header and our footer is still in the theme. We're going to pull that out eventually. We're going to build patterns for it. But right now, it's just kind of a blank slate right in the middle. Everything is coming from the pattern system. Everything is coming from paragraphs. So there's just one div. That's it.
And Drupal 8, like, you don't have the cleaning class needs that you did in Drupal 7. Like, it's all, I mean, it's, if you use stable instead of classy, you're fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I mean, you're fine, but you still have over 9,000 divs. Like, that did not go away. And that's still there.
Yeah.
Also depends on how hard you work.
Divs are still there.
Like you can make most of it go away.
Yeah, like you have to edit pretty much every single one of them. That's the click templates and you just remove the div every time that's going on.
I wanted to show
Or you
like
can
a
zero out your field animation by twig templates or all the skills out for the content and just get rid of a lot of this from fields.
So yeah, this is a twig template for that band header component. So you can see, here's our divs, we're defining the classes, we're, passing information through to the data attributes and exposing that as a configuration option to the content admin. We're changing out H2s and H1s on the title based on the selector. So we have like one field we call SEO emphasis. So wherever your keywords are, because we had this problem where we're like, some content people are putting it in that little red headline at the top, some people are putting it in the big black headline going across the page. How do we know? And they're like, well, it depends on the page, it depends on the content. So we're like, okay. So we gave them a field where they could say, I want the H1 to be here, because this is the important keyword saturated information that we need Google to know about. Here's the flowery marketing speak, that can be an H2 or a paragraph or whatever. So we expose that as a setting. And everything else is really straightforward. I mean, we're not, you can see this is a pretty short template. So there's no crufty divs or classes or anything from Drupal. And I think that's it. And like I said, the resources are on this page. And you can follow me on Twitter at kendalltotten. And I'm tweeting more links and resources, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.